Guillermo del Toro is one of my favorite directors, writers, and producers. And in 2021, I tried to do a full Guillermo del Toro retrospective before his latest TV show anthology, Cabinet of Curiosities, release. Like all of my Halloween projects, this one got away from me, started in like September and went all the way through November. But that did cut this project off with a script for Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water. And now, Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan have recently released on Amazon Originals collection, The Boy in the Iron Box series, which I'll definitely be reading and reviewing on the channel, as Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan previously have written the Strain series, and I had always wanted to read those books and compare it to the TV show and never got around to it. So now is a great time for me to get a little taste of the Del Toro Chuck Hogan combo together and see if it's really Chuck Hogan that I didn't like in the Strain TV series, or if there was an issue with that project as a whole larger than his addition to the mix. And to get us back into the mood for more Guillermo del Toro and to celebrate that as of this video's release, we're in the middle of the Love in the Night Paranormal Readathon, which I'm participating in, we would go ahead and talk about that one movie Del Toro did that happens to be a monster romance. Background details in Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water. It was originally released in 2017. It was directed by Guillermo del Toro and it was written by Vanessa Taylor and Guillermo del Toro together. And this is Guillermo del Toro's award-winning film. He won both Best Picture and Best Director off The Shape of Water. And while there are many works of Del Toro's that I prefer, of all of his artistic body of work, I do think The Shape of Water might be one of the more accessible ways to get a really good glimpse at what Del Toro likes. The story is really straightforward, the characters embody some very specific American time period stereotypes. Is The Shape of Water Gothic? To my surprise, I found it embodies quite a few of the 9 elements. For anyone who's new on the channel or anyone who doesn't quite remember, we have 9 elements that make something Gothic, and you only need 3 of those to qualify. Shape of Water has 7. Starting off with the horror elements. I'd say, yes, I was scared during this story, but it came from unexpected places, where traditionally you might be afraid because of the monster. Instead, the actual facility itself kind of creeped me out. The boss of this facility made me very concerned for the safety of our mute lead and her ensemble of diverse friends. I also think the willingness to experiment on the monster and to be incredibly cruel and cause it significant pain is one of those human horrors that we all sort of know humanity is capable of, but find chilling when portrayed on screen. Number 2. Character is king. This is definitely a character-driven production. I think exactly who our lead is, the fact that she's mute, why she's mute, how she does this work, how she builds a relationship with this creature. All of it is what's driving our story. And then of course her ensemble of friends, the neighbor who's secretly gay, trying to get his job back, trying to find a relationship, and sort of trying and failing at a lot of things, feeling sort of an outcaster who's been thrown aside both in his career and his love life, makes it compelling. And as he is the narrator who takes over the ending of the story, who he is and why he would believe certain things becomes a key plot point. I also think Eliza's friend Zelda becomes a key player because how she's been dismissed by many people in power and how she responds to that by choosing to remain loyal to Eliza despite her husband's betrayal. All of that comes into play, being really important and creating this found family core of what's happening in the narrative. Number 3, more poetic prose. As this translates to visual storytelling, I always find Guillermo del Toro's directorial style and art imagery to be very unique. It won Best Picture, and there's a good reason for that. It did a lot of really engaging and interesting things, made these beautiful visuals. I don't think anyone can deny The Shape of Water has a poetic sort of play to it. Number 4, elements of loneliness and longing. Both the monster and the protagonist have several elements of isolation. Since Eliza can't talk, she does have some trouble communicating with other people, and people sometimes assume that she is unintelligent because she doesn't speak, which sort of further isolates her from potential lines of communication. The monster also isn't doing a great job communicating with others, and perhaps the scientists don't really want to communicate with him, which is part of the issue. But either way, both of them have sort of been ostracized by like normal society. I think most of Eliza's found family have character traits that have sort of pushed them outside of the bounds of normal society and made them feel alone, isolated, and ostracized. The film does take these various isolated characters and show them coming together to create their own found family and to make their own kind of like in-group and supportive structure. I do think that champion community and choosing to appreciate each other's similarities instead of separating via our differences is a big part of this movie and the storytelling going on in the moment. The supernatural element. There's a swamp creature. Obviously, there's something science fiction or supernatural happening within the story. Beyond that, the end scene where Eliza transforms into her own version of the swamp creature, if that's really what's happening, there's a whimsical, supernatural, magical moment where the swamp creature is able to transform her and save her life. Questioning a character's mental health. I'm back and forth on this question personally because I don't ever question whether or not Eliza is of sound mind and body. However, the people in power treat her like a simpleton, which means that they could take over advocacy for her or have her committed or overthrow her own bodily autonomy at any moment. And that is definitely part of the questioning a character's mental health and reality Gothic element. Her vulnerability in that regard, I think, gives her the point, even though it doesn't give us that, like, are we dreaming or is this real kind of element you'd usually see in this sort of Gothic mental health examination. Makes use of local folklore and superstition, not any that I saw, but I'm not like super knowledgeable on the swamp thing in general, so perhaps this monster does like make significantly more references to older movies that I'm just not aware of. As it stands, I think it has a little bit of that Disney-fied, bygone, old Americana era, where it sort of like overemphasized the good and the bad that was happening within that time period. It does have like this almost storybook element to it, but I think I'm gonna put that down into more poetic prose, the art direction, instead of like the fairy tale fable element here. And then lastly is gonna be like that strong sense of place, and again, not to me. I do think for some people this like historic element in American history and the way specifically it's portrayed is gonna feel very familiar and like grounded, but for me personally it didn't do that. Which rolls me into my personal observations. The visuals are definitely the most interesting part of this story. They're really pleasant to watch, and it really helped me sit through the entirety of the story. And something that occurred to me is I probably wouldn't want to read a Shape of Water book because a lot of the draw comes from the visual art on screen. For storytelling components, I felt like this was a very simple story. The notable thing to me was that they swap into voiceover after Eliza gets shot and Giles ends up telling the rest of the story. I found it a little bit jarring because there wasn't voiceover until this point, and I think that's because we were getting the story from Eliza's perspective and Eliza is mute, but going into like this forced perspective, someone telling me what was happening, when it was happening, wasn't giving me the same level of discernment and interpretation that I was before, and it wasn't giving me the same sort of like freedom to look at the visuals and tell my own story. Also, swapping into Giles' perspective for me personally made me question a lot of what was happening at the end, because his job is to paint these beautiful Norman Rockwell-esque kind of ads for things that sort of idealize everything that's happening, tell the best version of things. So I was wondering like if Eliza had actually just been shot and killed and he's telling this story about how she like got transformed into a river monster and is living her best life with him out at sea, you know, because for him he's never going to see her again either way, so might as well give her that happily ever after. So I didn't know if he was basically painting us a beautiful picture of something that didn't happen, or if she actually transformed there at the end. And I don't really know which way I prefer it, because certainly if Eliza 100% transformed, then we could just continue to get her perspective without any voiceover all the way through. And that brings us into the story. I thought the movie was a little too long. So by that logic, I have to say the story overall is probably mid-tier. It's worth noting that of all the movies that I ended up reviewing, this one is one of the few Del Toro stories I didn't go to theaters to see. Even back when it first came out and when it was getting so much hype and praise, that wasn't enough to draw me into the theater to go see it for the first time. To me, it's kind of like offering that standard outsider found family kind of story, but it's not doing anything super new or unique. Again, the visuals are really pretty. There are individual touching moments, but there's a lot in between that feels sort of like meandering to me. And it might just be that I read a lot of outsider stories and a lot of found family stories, so like I'm very familiar with that narrative, and you really have to go above and beyond to give me something. And I think overall, Del Toro's work is usually more complex and nuanced than I just personally found Shape of Water. And that complexity and nuance is like what I go to Del Toro for. So this work just wasn't really scratching that itch for me personally. Some overarching themes in Del Toro's filmography. The Shape of Water manifests Del Toro's love of all things monster. In his interviews, he often talks about how much he loves monsters, how he sides with them in most stories, and how he finds something like empathetic and compelling in them. And I really think The Shape of Water is him sort of showing that to most modern audiences. There's hints in his other work, like in Pacific Rim, we have the one scientist who's obsessed with the kaiju. And we can see it in things like The Orphanage, where the main female lead is trusting what scares and repulses most, or in Mama, where the ghost is what keeps those two young children alive and shows them like love and care for years on end. Or even in Crimson Peak, where the ghosts are actually the good guys warning our protagonist about her treacherous husband. They look terrifying, but they're really just misunderstood. So there is a satisfying arc in The Shape of Water when you look at the larger body of Del Toro's work, because Eliza is here choosing the monster over the human and recognizing that actions speak louder than words. And in this case, the monster is the one who shows her kindness and understanding where humans have treated her poorly. There is a small complicating factor where Eliza has these scars on her neck, and one has to ask if she was always part monster, if these were always gills, or if that's something that like the monster like quote unquote transforms when she gets shot so that the two of them can live a happily ever after. There's also this critique on white men that sort of runs through most of Del Toro's work. I'd say that this is his most blatant iteration of it, where like the normal government dude who's running the program is obviously sexist, racist, homophobic, and awful. He's awful to his wife, he's awful to Eliza, and at the same time sexually like interested in her in a way that's aggressive and unwanted. He's kind of everything bad all at once in a way that is like dramatically obvious. But this Strickland character does remind me a lot of Ophelia's stepfather in Pan's Labyrinth. There's echoes of that overconfidence, thoughtlessness in both characters. And I can also see a little bit from like the main male lead in Crimson Peak, where yes, eventually he does sort of choose the right thing and try to protect the protagonist from an imminent death, but he goes about it thinking that he can have both her and his sister in some kind of weird, gross relationship. Just the sheer confidence that both these women would agree to this and that he could have a happily ever after like this is astounding on so many levels. And we can also look at the brother in Mama. He is not in a lot of that movie, but the fact that he's so certain he's the right person to take care of those two girls, even though his girlfriend doesn't want any children, even though he has no experience with children, even though his brother was going to murder those two girls after he had murdered his wife, but for some reason he, as the blood-related brother, was a better pick than the wife's mother. None of that ever made sense, like that sheer confident bullheadedness of it all. Someone who's like more self-aware and more interested in what's actually best for the girls might have handed them off to stepmother to live across the country. I know someone who was like experienced with children, who would share stories of their mother to them, who wouldn't remind them of maybe the awful things that his brother had done to them right before he died. Like that would have been the better outcome for those girls. But the brother doesn't roll like that. He just wants what he wants and thinks he's entitled to it. And I think this is an interesting like deconstruction deconstruction of masculinity and what it means to be masculine and the negative traits inherent in like that strong male figure. And to me, even though Del Toro is often lauded as someone who creates well-rounded feminine characters, which I generally agree with, it's actually in his deconstruction of the male role that I think we see more quote-unquote feminist agenda in Del Toro's work. The Shape of Water is a big fantasy with a lot of moving pieces, and Del Toro does creepy, scary fantasy very well in pretty much everything he touches. Like all of Del Toro's work, this is highly stylized and a joy to watch. I think The Shape of Water on its own doesn't interest me a ton, but when you place it in Del Toro's larger body of work, there's quite a few interesting conversations to be had about where it belongs and what might have driven him to make this latest iteration of themes and collections. So these are all my thoughts on The Shape of Water as the most mainstream of monster romances here in the Paranormal Romance Readathon week. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys are reading something fun. Let me know in the comments down below if you're participating in any October readathons and what your most anticipated read is this month. And as always, keep reading.